Everyone has an opinion of what makes a podcast grow, but the data always tells a different story. That's what we're getting into in today's episode, and I'm joined by two powerhouses in this industry to help me dissect some of the most important data you will review this year. Let's get into it. Hello. Welcome to this week's episode of As It Relates to Podcasting. I'm Simona Costantini, host of the show and also founder of Volt Productions, which is a full-service podcast production agency. Today, I'm joined by Megan Dougherty, who's the creator and the mastermind and the brain behind the State of Business Podcasting Report and the absolute genius behind One Stone Creative. Also joining us today is Ana Xavier, who's the creator and the founder of the podcast space. And together we are diving into the nitty-gritty of all of the podcast data that's in this year's State of Business Podcasting Report. You can find the link to the report in the episode notes below so you can download your copy. But there are some really powerful insights in here that'll help you when it comes to everything regarding your podcast. The launching side of your podcast, growing your podcast, show notes, titles, episode length, so on. The report is a benchmark. It's meant to help you make some decisions with your content if that's what you're looking to do, or even just to give you some education on how the market is, what's going on right now, and what you need to know. So without further ado, let's get into our conversation. Please be sure to reach out if you have any questions at all and grab your copy of the report in the notes below. Hello. I'm so excited to have you both here joining me on the podcast today. I don't do a lot of guest interviews on the show, but this one felt like something that we just had to do. And Megan, you and I were talking about the report, the data, and we were talking on a call a couple weeks ago. And I thought to myself, I'm like, I feel like this would be really informative, really helpful for the listener, for the audience to actually bring in some of the data, put some actual thoughts behind the numbers and what they mean. And then I thought to myself, I'm like, hold on. I'm like, Ana is so great at data and research and numbers and really good at taking that and how do we use that to help your overall strategy. So I thought, I'm like, you both need to be here for this conversation because it would not be the same. So super excited. Do you each want to maybe take like a 30 seconds and just introduce yourselves and what you do?
So mine's Megan Dougherty. I'm co-founder of One Stone Creative, a podcast production agency that specializes in revenue positive podcasts for small businesses. And as Simona has alluded to, I am the publisher of the annual State of Business Podcasting Report, which is a deep dive into the top 100 business podcasts that we've been releasing since 2020. So we have just released the 6th annual edition of the report. That's probably the coolest thing that we do overall.
I'm Ana Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space, and beyond being a data nerd who actually loves looking at reports like Megan's, I bring all of the data and try to figure out like, what do we talk about? What's a content strategy that's going to impact driven business owners to their goals? And how do we market the podcast in a way that feels sustainable and exciting? Because as we know, podcasting is a long-term goal, that it's a long-term game, should I say. And so we gotta stay it in and have fun. So let's get into the data. I'm excited, Simona.
Me too. I'm so excited. I really can't wait to dive into this conversation, especially to bounce off of what you just said, Ana. The whole marketing piece, the whole growth piece, the way SEO is continuing to change, the way we have AI integrations now. When I went through the data, when I was reading through the report, there was actually quite a bit in there that shocked me in terms of stats and in terms of data. And so, Megan, I'm going to throw this question to you first. What was maybe the one thing or a couple things that were the most surprising to you in going through the data and seeing the numbers?
Definitely. And I'm hoping you'll both also share what was interesting and surprising to you, because
Yes.
I've been in this for so long, right? And I've been doing this for so many years. So less surprises me now than it did the first couple of years I was doing this.
True.
But there were some really interesting things that I found super fascinating. And the first one was about hooks. So, the hook of the sizzle clip at the beginning of the podcast. When we started doing this report, hooks were not very popular. People just started their episodes. Then after a couple of years, clips from the body of the episode became the most popular strategy. And having some kind of hook or content before the intro is still the most popular, but a clip from the audio has been surpassed by a live recording from the host, whether with or without music. But that is kind of a shift that's happening. It seems obviously that first couple of seconds is really important for listeners, but now it's a personal message from the host rather than a teaser from maybe the guest or body content without context. So I thought that was a really fascinating evolution. And if you'd like another one, Something that I thought was really fascinating as we look at the rise of video podcasting over the last couple of years has been, meteoric. And so we decided to look at, on the video heavy platforms, YouTube and TikTok specifically, how many people are not just sharing their podcast content, but only using podcast content for like their shorts and their clips. And I thought it was a surprising number of shows where really that's the only video that they're doing on these video platforms are clips from their podcast, rather than that plus other types of content. So those were kind of my two big, that's fascinating from this year.
That's a really interesting thought too, especially from a clips perspective, because within our agency, we have clients who only do clips, right? And I was actually on a call yesterday with my membership, and we were talking about different ways to take content and repurpose it from your podcast episode. And I had suggested, well, why don't you just go into your stories and talk about it? And they were like, wow, what a good idea. And I was like, I think we get inundated with all of this video content and how clips are created that we actually forget that we can go and literally talk about the episode if we want to. I'm not the best example of that. Don't even ask me about my story strategy on Instagram. Anna has problems with my story strategy.
I don't even do video.
Megan's like, what video? I'm just kidding.
I mean, I think the outcome of that is like, it doesn't matter what strategy you're having. As long as you have a strategy, you can be successful in different elements, right?
Exactly.
The good old OG, like networking, sending a pigeon or a crow, doing video. It just doesn't matter. You can do it. But yeah, no, I think that it was really interesting. And for me, it's really realizing that when we're looking at these big shows, if you are a podcaster listening to this, also know that these people most of the times have a big team behind it. And so they have the capacity to create clips. And talking from a sustainability point of view, I think that if you're someone who spends way too much time editing the clips, like what is a strategy that's going to help you? Like if you're thinking about, I want to get into TikTok, stop trying to figure out like every single clip, every single second. Can you leverage a tool? Because we have so many, to your point, Simona, we have so many tools like AI based that can really help people get to those goals that they have, right? If they want to do more video. Like that's one of my favorite tips is just like grab your phone, talk directly to your audience. If you follow, like for instance, like an example of this is Amy Porterfield, that she records her like direct to camera on her phone and she goes, oh my gosh. And then she starts with a hook and then she goes, in these podcast episode, I'm talking about this and that, right? Like again, the humanity of why you should listen, like that hook brings to like, almost like telling a friend like, oh my gosh, this podcast episode is like gonna blow your mind because of, and then insert X. I think that those are really mindful from the standpoint of the host saying like, hey, I know your time is valuable and I'm gonna make sure that you know from the get-go. Just kind of like try to implement some of those takeaways instead of focusing on like a heavily produced like intro that is like super slick and has like those, kind of transitions and music and all that. Like what is it that they're saying and how can you replicate and what is the listener experience at that end?
I really like that point too. And I want to bounce off of that for a second, because one of the things that I've been talking about a lot lately, especially when it comes to video clips, video content, like we do a lot of video content within the agency. All of our clients have a video component in some capacity. And one thing that I think about all the time is those clips that you see on social that are so random. They have no context to them. People don't understand what placement of this is this in the podcast. What are we talking about? And so on. It makes me think, even aligned with the hook, what is the story that you're telling with your content, no matter what touch point someone has with your content? You need to be able to tell that story from start to finish. And I think of someone like Diary of a CEO, for example. Every clip that you see and that you watch does well because there's a story that's executed behind it. It's enough to bring the person along for the journey and leave them wanting more. Now, there's also the argument that, all the clips that you do put on social media, they don't necessarily convert directly into listeners. That's hard data to get, in my opinion. But there's something to be said about creating that interest and generating that buzz and wanting someone to come along for that story. But I want to share my most surprising stat. Well, one of the most surprising ones to me was the churn rate, and that it was 48%. Yes. That to me, I know that podcasters die out. Like I know that there's pod fade. I know that there's people who, do 6, 7, 8 episodes, maybe 10, and then you call it a day. But I'm curious, what do we think is driving almost half of the top business shows to disappear or to be replaced? Do we think it's quality? Do we think it's market? Do we think it's resources? Do we think it's a strategy issue? A lot of podcasters that I talk to, especially business podcasters, they like the show. They don't know how to grow it. They don't know how to bring video in. They're tired of the weekly cadence. Like, what do we think? What do we think it is?
Part of that, now having looked at the kind of the top 100 shows, and this is from Apple Podcasts is where we get the data.
Perfect.
Their criteria for the top 100 is murky and unclear, and I don't get it necessarily. So there's, I think, a lot going on behind the scenes of those rankings specifically from Apple that we don't know. Because I look at some of the shows on the list and I'm like, really? But it's on the list. Like that's what's there, right? So some of it is, I think there's just machinations happening behind the scenes that we don't necessarily see. And I think for other ones, I mean, being the 101 podcast still means be a pretty big show. And so some shows that are on the list, they come in, they're in 1 year, they're out the next year, they're back in the next year. So I think there's probably closer to 250 or so that are kind of rotating in or out of the top. And some shows with really aggressive launch campaigns, they get up there with 2 episodes. It's a top 100 show from the first episode, but then they're gone. They're never seen again after that initial launch window, right? So I think that's contributing to it as well. There's some that have been there every year for the whole 6 years we've been doing it too. So
I have this theory, and again, a lot of times we all run agencies or work in consulting, so we hear this time and time again. But a lot of people are always concerned when a celebrity launches a podcast. Right? Like they're like, oh my God. And we know from data that shows that like the biggest podcasts, Diary CEO being one of them, do take over of, are kind of like representative 90% of the shows that audiences consume. And then only 10% of the other time is consumed by like smaller shows. But there is a little element of like, okay, sure, yes, it takes space, but like the amount of celebrities that start podcasts because they were just presented with like a sponsorship opportunity. And then they're not really in it for the long run. They're just like, okay, this sounds like a fun thing to try. Let's go for it, right? And so then after a while, once the money goes out, and we know for this year that a lot of advertiser money like moved in and out. Like it was just like a hot mess. Some people are like, people continue to spend money in podcasting. Yes, they do. But like, again, at the same time, companies are like, we want to associate our money with like some sort of like return on investment as well. It's not just like, oh yeah, like, hey, celebrity, here's some money because we know you're going to bring a big audience, whether they're like singers or, actors or whatever. And I think that there's a huge kind of disconnect between what people think that celebrities do for like a harnessing audience. They just like get really overwhelmed. And I think there's too many people who are like, okay, sure, I'll take the money, but they don't really care about podcasting. So they're in and out. And I think for that point, there's still a lot of people who are not in it for the right reasons, in the sense of that they understand that it's a long term. They have an actual goal with the show. And I think that influences a lot of people still to get on board. But again, they come and go. And so I think we've matured enough as an industry for people to know that, if you get into this, it's going to be a lot of work, right? Like it's going to include a lot of work. So for people who are not celebrities, I think that people who are willing to look at the industry as it's shifting and moving a little bit more toward video and a bit more permeable, a little more like flexible in terms of formats. And some people, that's enough for them to be like, no, too many players. I'm not special anymore. Sorry. And so they're like, I'm not having the reach I had before. Also, there's a lot more accuracy in how downloads are measured. And so I feel like a lot of people see those numbers go down and they're like, that's it. I'm going to be out in no time. I might as well just like stop podcasting altogether. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions that are leading people to this besides the burnout. But I think that mainly is misconceptions. I would say like if you have a podcast producer or strategist, like ask them these questions, because I think that a lot of people give up their shows because they just don't understand the data and the impact that they're having. So that's my 2 cents on there.
That kind of touches on something that I do want to make clear about the State of Business Podcasting Report, is that it is not a recipe for a successful podcast. It's not a strategy for a successful podcast. These shows are not in the top 100 because they do the things that are like the data that we track, right? This is a snapshot in time of what successful shows happen to be doing. And, we can reverse. And that's, I think, a really important distinction for anyone who's looking at this data, or maybe they're thinking about podcasting, to understand just because you put your headshot on the cover art and you release weekly, that doesn't mean you're going to be successful as a podcaster. That just happens to be the most common thing that the most successful business podcasts do. It's a snapshot in time of this particular group of shows, but it's not prescriptive. The most profitable podcasts that I produce, they're never going to be on the top 100 list. They're really small niche podcasts that are like working like little workhorses of dray ponies in their businesses, but they're not big shows. And so there's limitations to that data. So I just wanted to make clear that that's kind of something important to consider when looking at it.
That's actually, that's perfect. I love that distinction too. And you know what's interesting? I'm thinking to myself, as you're saying, these shows will not make the top 100. There are so many creators out there that look to listen notes to get the percentage of what their podcast is. And there's nothing that drives me more insane. Yes, it makes you feel good to look at that and see that your show's in the top 3%, but it's not actually the 3%. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of false advertising, I think, in my opinion, that comes from different podcasters, because all it takes is for me to go and look at the charts and I can tell if that show is actually in the top 100. You know what's really interesting? I was doing a strategy call the other day with a client that I've been working with for the last month. We're doing some stuff for his podcast relaunch next season of his show for next year. And he was telling me about this podcaster, I won't say who it is, and that the show is about helping you get your podcast in the top 100. I'm like, oh, interesting premise. Okay, sounds really good. So I went to go and look at the show and listen to it. And that show doesn't even rank in the top 100. I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, you're teaching people how to rank in the top 100, but you don't even break the top 100. I'm like, what? Like, this impeccable. Is crazy. I know. I'm like, well, maybe you did at one time, but and there's definitely the information that the person was sharing was so great also. Like, there was a lot of great info in there. There's a lot of great stuff in there. Because the podcast data is so unclear, they either think the show doesn't do as well and they're not like comparable to other people in the industry, or they think their show does so well that they're sitting in the top 1%, and then they start talking about how they're a 1% podcaster. And I'm like, neither of those are true. I was on a discovery call yesterday with someone who we're going to be doing some strategy work for. And I showed her placement in the chart. She's like, we really don't have a lot of reach. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, you are literally sitting in the top 60 for careers. And I'm like, that's really good. But that's based off of all of the different charts. Anyways, I digress. Go ahead.
So there's like, I'm a top 5% podcaster, I'm a top 3% podcaster. And to a podcast industry insider, it's a little cringe. But for a lot of businesses, their audiences don't know that. They've got this stat from a legitimate source. Why not use it in the marketing, right? It does it. So I mean, I really see the kind of the two sides of it. On the one hand, it's just like, okay, but listen to us. But on the other hand, well, hey, if it's helping your branding, if it's helping your marketing, if it's good for you, then you know what? Go to town.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I can
see you there. You're like,
oh, I have something to say. And this is where, again, like whatever does it for you, so it kind of gets you motivated to go. But yeah, I was at a podcast conference and everywhere is just podcasters, and this person introduces themselves, first name, second name, and they go, and I am the host of the 0.1% podcast in the whatever category. And I'm like, it's just, again, it's that's when you go, okay, that doesn't say anything. But that's where people hold on to those little like things, right? But again, what are you doing with your show? I don't care that you are a 0.5%. Like, I, as a listener, want you to give me really helpful information, or to really be great at entertaining me, or at getting me to take action, right? And so I think that is always like really interesting from our standpoint as professionals. But like, cool for you.
It's the purpose behind the show though too, right? What is the intention of the show? What is the purpose of the show? Because, you can have a podcast that's a weekly podcast. Megan, I know that you do a lot of series-based content as well. We do a lot of weekly. We do some series. We do a lot of bi-weekly, a lot of bi-weekly podcasts, because creators are burnt out and people are tired, but they want to still have the podcast. They still want to do the show. But it's really interesting to me because I wasn't overly surprised to see that the weekly podcast still dominates, you know what I mean? Because like most people have a weekly podcast. But what was interesting to me was the daily publishing, how many people are creating daily podcasts. I'm like, wow, power to you. That is a huge undertaking, daily podcast. It's fantastic. I wish.
Important to know, daily shows are short. Very few of them are longer than 10, 15 minutes, and most of them are under 10. And I think a strategy I love that has kind of been revealed over the last couple of years is like long weekly interview show. Short little comment on the news on Fridays. You can get that out really fast. Most people in podcast support, they can even just edit themselves, slap the intro and outro on that one real fast, right? So it's a great way to up your cadence, because then cadence really makes a difference to downloads.
But then also too, though, if you're bringing in like that video component though, that's where people can get blocked. It's like, oh my God, okay, now I gotta sit down and I gotta look good and I gotta put my makeup on. Like, I gotta do my hair. Like, you know what I mean?
So there's been some of these popular guys are dudes who don't have to bother doing that.
Exactly. Exactly. It's actually so true. I think to myself all the time, I'm like, oh, okay, I gotta sit down, gotta record, I gotta look good. You know what I mean? And I've done so many interviews and so much stuff where I don't have any makeup on, no hair done, like whatever. And I look back and I'm like, could have put a mascara. You know what I mean? Or I should have put my glasses on or something. Like I should have put something on there.
It's still about like the power of showing up regardless.
Yeah.
And I think that as women, I do stand on my like little like 2 cents about this, and my little like, okay, what if men don't need to wear makeup? Why do women? We should be taken
Very
seriously
true.
anyway. Regardless.
Very true.
And so I am not wearing makeup on this interview either. But I would like to tell people, like, if getting, makeup and whatever gets in the way of creating a consistent release schedule, what can you change? And I love that idea of having like the kind of like the short commentary episode on a different day. And a creator that is one of the top podcasters that I love, Jay Klaus, he is the host of Creator Science. And he does this voice notes. It's called voice notes. And so he records, there's no intro or outro. It's just like, hey, here's Jay. And so he talks directly to the listener. And I think that there's, again, audio quality is important. The audio quality is there. It's not just like huffing and puffing, like plosives and whatever. But there's that intimacy, right? Like it's kind of like, oh, I'm listening to Jay talking to me. And so I think that there's a little bit of freedom where we are right now, that it's not like, oh my gosh, like you're so unprofessional, you don't have an intro and outro. It's like everything else, the content is so good that you are up to a level that you can let it slide a little bit on that second and experiment. And again, this is what I love. Like Jay is experimenting and saying, hey, let me know if you like these. What do you think about it? Because he's writing a book, and it's like it makes it more off the cuff. And I think that even bigger podcasters are experimenting. And I think that if a big podcaster is doing that, you are listening to this, allow yourself to actually play with a format or with a new style. Maybe you've never done video, do those like sound bites. Maybe you do like uploads from my phone, whatever it is. But I think that is really neat to experiment with. Can we go back to one thing that we have not talked about yet, which is the show notes and discoverability?
Yes. You know what? I actually wanted to ask about discoverability also in terms of like retention. Let's go show notes first.
No, go first. So the show notes, I mean, I was not surprised by this, but in season 4 of the podcast space, I actually analyzed 2 of the biggest podcasts that I adore, which is the Caristo, The Future, and the Jasmine Star Show. And so I was looking and talking about like the discoverability, like I'm like, are they following best practices? And they were not. Like one of them had like 2 paragraphs, and it was like, again, those 100 words. And then like one of the shows, which I'm not gonna name names, but it had like, I think I counted 27 links. They were wasting the character count on links. And I was like, first off, the user experience is terrible because you just have to keep like scrolling down to the bottom. But like, I'm like, okay, this is someone who has already such a big audience. They've built such a name for themselves that they don't need to worry about these things. But if you're a podcaster looking for like, what are the big ones doing? You would be like, oh yeah, they only have like 2 paragraphs, short ones. Like, I don't need to worry about it. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Because yeah, like again, if you don't have a big platform, if you don't come with a pre-existing audience and you're looking for discoverability and to get found, I mean, you need like to write more than 100 words. I'm sorry, like you just have to.
I want to add in on this too, because I have friends who are massive creators. I know people who have huge podcasts. I have a whole bunch of plugins, on my computer and stuff as well, where we can analyze different data and different shows, especially on the YouTube side. And what I will say is what has worked in the past likely will not work in the future. I can't be 100% certain about that in saying that, but in my professional opinion, I don't think that what always worked in the past is going to work today. These big creators that I know and that I'm friends with, their shows literally reach half the amount of people that they used to. So I think to myself, maybe you have, your one editor that you've been working with for the last 7 years in the podcast, you've grown your audience and so on, but what is the thing that is going to keep them there? But even further than that, how do you continue growing your audience? I can think of some pretty big business people out there who have done different launches, launched different programs and courses and so on. And those launches don't go according to plan the way that they have in the past. And they really struggled to launch their product, their service, or whatever it is, because the old way of doing it just doesn't work anymore. And so I think there's a huge opportunity, if you're not going to get ahead of it, and if you're a big creator and you're like, well, I already have the audience, I don't really need to do anything to continue to push the boundary and to shift and da-da-da. If I were to do a strategy audit on that show in particular, there's 100 things that I would change. And all of it would probably give more discoverability and more reach in that way. So curious to know what your thoughts. Megan, you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, on the show notes, kind of the kind of apparent care and attention that these big shows put on the broadcast. This was when I first did the very, very first report back in 2020, back in those, halcyon days when everything was beautiful in podcasting. I was shocked to my boots at how many of these really big shows seem to put so little care and attention into their editing, into intros and outros, into show notes. It seems like the bigger you are, if you've got this existing audience, you don't have to care about your audience. They're going to love you no matter what you do. They're going to pay attention to what you, no matter what you do. They're going to buy from you no matter what you do. So you don't have to put a lot of time into doing this. Smaller companies can't get away with that. We're not going to be able to, just do the bare minimum and expect to be taken as seriously as a big guy who's doing the bare minimum. And I think with AI, and maybe I'll introduce the AI into the conversation now, because that's big. When we're reviewing these, it's always difficult with like the notes and things like that. Do we look at what's on the website? Do we look at what's on YouTube? Do we look at what's on Spotify? What's a show note these days? So that's
True.
It's part of just making the judgment call. But boy, I saw a lot of Cast Magic show notes. I can clock them at 100 yards.
Or Riverside ones too.
Yeah,
which is it's great to have those tools for people.
What's the point though? If you, I mean, yes, you're creating the audio content, but if you're having everything else done by AI, then other bots are seeing it. At what point is a human actually going to be involved in this decision? And so I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know how many shows use AI. We didn't run anything through an AI detector; those don't work anyway. But I think it's really interesting. Where is the effort? What's the relationship to effort to outcome? It's really hard to figure out.
That's such a good point. Even in the production work that we do with our clients, we use AI in the editing side. I mean, we use Dissect. Dissect has AI, even just your text editor, it's going to go in and it's going to remove all of your ums for you, Well, we add them back. Like the ones that are relevant and need to go back there, we'll go and add them back. But I'm transparent about that, but there's a huge piece of even just creating clips, for example, is still something that we do very much manually. I like to find the part that's in it because, again, I think that the point of having a podcast or a YouTube channel or content that you are creating and putting out there, whether it's a blog or a newsletter, there is a story arc in every single piece of content that you are creating. So how does that story arc lend itself to your podcast as well, and to your clips, and to all of the things that you're doing? So I don't know. I just think that that's a really important piece. And sometimes when we use so much AI, it takes away from what is the actual story that we're trying to tell here. It's not a bad thing to use it, but it's how are we using it to add value to the show versus making it sound like everything else, because you don't want your show to sound like everything else. You want it to stand out.
I'm going to make a side note on here because I am the one in this group right now that English is not my first language. And I am a perfectionist. I'm trying to own that. I used to be like, I have high working standards. And I was like, no, it is perfectionism. And so I would spend hours upon hours writing descriptions when I first launched the podcast space back in 2023, the podcast, not the company. And so when AI came out, I was like, oh my gosh, I will take this because it helped me progress and make sure that my grammar was right. However, I am aware that sometimes I'm like, this does not sound like me. And I would still change it, perhaps potentially ruining the grammar. But I was like, I want this to sound like a real human or to sound like me. But today, what I do is I have a process that I tell specifically the AI which format I want it to follow so that it sounds more like me. But I hear you, Megan, when you're it's just a spit out of whatever format it has, whatever AI tool has. So I think that there's room for some customization, but I want everyone to think about if show notes is one of the reasons why you get so stuck every single week or whatever you're trying to follow best practices. Here's something that I think is actionable. Do take those, make sure that you are creating something that is more appealing, that starts with a hook and all that. However, do that for that week, but then make some time to actually batch edit those and maybe use a tool that will make you sound more like you or add more from your personal perspective. you don't need to do, not everything is permanent, right? Like if you upload a file to YouTube, you kind of cannot really replace it, but show notes, you can edit them. So if you are listening to yourself and you're like, that is me, you can always make time and then just edit all of those out and make them sound more human and improve upon them. Really use AI strategically, but know that you can always go back and like change some of those things. Not everything is final. So like that is one thing that I will say. If you're getting too stuck because you're like, I want my show notes to be optimized, but by the end of it, I don't have the capacity or whatever it is, do that later, but do it.
Exactly.
I love that. And I mean, it comes down to your goal for podcasting, right? Not every show needs elaborate show notes, but there's nothing stopping you from every 6 months being like, what are my most popular shows for the last 6 months? Okay, I'm going to do good notes for now. Follow the data. I know, like for our production, for our clients, we don't use AI for written work, full stop, except that which we cannot avoid, like in systems that are now, we try not to use it because I've costed it out again and again, trying these different tools. And I mean, environmental concerns and plagiarism concerns all aside, it costs me more to fact check it or have a human fact check it than it does to just do it in person the first time. So the business case isn't there. I cannot emotionally stand the thought of the humiliation in sending an AI mistake to a client or putting out an AI mistake on a client. A human mistake, cool. We're humans. We make them. Not an AI. I just can't do it.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Well, you're relying on it. And like how many people don't go and fact check? That's like the whole other thing. You know what I mean? And that's a huge thing. But, you know, kind of what you were saying, Anna, just to pull from that for a second is that you can leverage the different tools. So there is nothing that I ever put into AI that hasn't been created by a human first. You know what I mean? So if we're going to use AI for something, whatever, I don't know, to help optimize show notes or to, you know, get title ideas or whatever it is, just to jog some creativity, I'm putting the actual interview in, like I'm putting that transcript in. So I'm not like, hey, you know, whatever AI system you want to use, give me 3 titles about this topic. It's read this transcript. What are some ideas, you know? And then I like to send those. I'll send those to clients and I'll say, okay, here's what we've generated. But I think that there's like a level of transparency too that, you know, I like to make sure we have. But there's also a good thing too about it being able to capture your voice eventually. So we're talking about show notes and so on. And if you are someone who uses AI and, you know, it's part of your process and it's the thing that helps you get your episodes out every single week and so on, you have to think of the show notes that people come across, the titles that people read, even seeing those darn M dashes in all of the content. I'm like, oh my God, like you can go back and remove them. You know what I mean? But you also want to make sure that the content reads like kind of what you're saying, Anna, like reads like you. If you go and you read show notes and they sound so corporate and so stuffy and so this and that and whatever, but your voice on the podcast is bubbly and what, it doesn't make sense, right? And so what if we think about the things that are going to make someone click play on a podcast episode or be searchable in the podcast algorithms and in the LLMO, you know, models? Your show notes and your titles are keywords that is being pulled from. So if they don't make sense and if the content in it doesn't make sense, then you're going to have a hard time relating back to your audience and your listener. Those things affect growth. They impact overall growth. So that's just kind of my additional thought to that there. So if we're thinking about, and I mean, I could chat with you literally all day, but I try and keep these bite-sized for the audience. But I will say, and I will put this in here, you can go and you can download the report. The link is in the episode notes below. Be sure that you go and do that so that you can see some of this data that we're referencing and what we're talking about. But if you think about companies or businesses that are launching a show in 2026 or, you know, towards the end of 2025, 26, 27, what do we think is the number one mistake that we've seen? Maybe not mistake, maybe challenge, but number one mistake we've seen business owners do when they're designing their podcast strategy, and maybe some tips to help into 2026.
I can go right on now because I'm having a thought. So I primarily work with impact-driven business owners, but this seems to be true for most business owners. This report talks about how the shows mainly are sponsored. The majority of them are. They have like a monetization side to them. And business owners start a podcast and they say to themselves, this is to grow my business. Mm-hmm. And then the content strategy, i.e. what they talk about on the show, touches so ever slightly on what they actually do. And so I find that in 2026, especially, and let me this is not the moment if you're doing something else, come back to us. Listen right now. People are very distracted by a lot of overconsumption of just content in general. There's a lot of AI slop, a lot of just a
Noise.
barrage of content all the time. So if you are just hinting that you have products and services that your audience can buy or that they can work with you, stop hinting. Be so ever obvious. Start making more content, more episodes around the customer experience that people have. Bring in a customer. If you're the worst at touting your own, kind of wins, bring in clients. Let them do the talking. If anything, if that you're okay, I don't know if I can sit down. I mean, ask them to record little testimonials and you slap that in as a dynamically inserted ad within the middle of the show. Or talk about, if you're really passionate about educating, make sure that you give, basically you talk about case studies that you did. This is what I've done with a client. For instance, one of my clients that I had on the show, we talked about this very complicated phase of her life. Her husband had a series of strokes and he became severely disabled. So her whole strategy for the podcast and her own life change. So we needed to change that. And that episode was so powerful that a few clients converted from that show because they're oh my gosh, if this lady is doing this podcast after all of those things, I know Ana can help me in my more in comparison chill life. And so again, what is it that you do? And through just talking about the transformation, be more intentional. Don't just yap. Really talk about to the listener, hey, I would love to work with you. There's a lady called Nikki Ranch. She has a podcast called Sales Maven. And she is so good at talking about this. I highly recommend if you're really struggling. And it's just the buying signals. Sometimes people, all they want is an invitation. And so start inviting your listeners and make it so very obvious in the show notes that there's a link. Don't make them work. Simona, I went off the rails and I gave a gazillion notes, but this is my note for 2026.
Don't go off the rails in 2026. No, just kidding.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, if I could count the number of times, I agree with you so much. And I I get on a call with somebody, and they're I want to start a podcast. That I can't. We've got to make sure it gets monetized, though. We got to make sure it's covering the expenses. It's bro, you're a tax preparer. You have services. You've written books. You've got online courses. You've got a membership community. Why do you want to sell sponsorships for 25 cents? Bro, stuff, my dude. There's way better ways to monetize your show.
Yes.
So yeah, and I think that kind of comes down to it's my advice for 2026 was the same as my advice for 2025 and before. In a business context, a podcast does not have any rules. It doesn't have any objective criteria for success or for format or for the way it needs to be. It's a tool that you design for your business to do a specific thing. And if it's different than what everybody else in the whole world does and it's working, cool, you're doing it right. And if it's exactly the same as a whole bunch of other people and it's working, cool, you're doing it right. The point is figuring out what is the outcome that matters. Will the podcast contribute to it? Can I measure it to see if it's working? And if you're doing those things, you're winning. You're winning at podcasting.
I love that. If I were to add one in also, I think I would say really understanding who it is that the content is for. One of the things that I like to say all the time when we do any type of podcast launch or podcast relaunch or strategy review or whatever it is that we're doing within the agency, I like to ask my clients, what is the mission of their show? Because if you don't understand what the mission and the purpose of the show is, you're going to have a really hard time understanding who is listening to the podcast. So I throw out 3 questions to you. What is the podcast about? Who is it for? And I used to say, why should they care? But I had a client say to me, we have a lot of shoulds in our life. We have a lot of shoulds and, we should do this, should do that, whatever. So I'm changing that question. Why do they care? So what is the podcast about? Who is it for? And why do they care? If you can answer those 3 questions, you create the basis for everything else that your show stands on. So I think that's really important. So if a business had to focus on just one metric to indicate to them whether their show is working or not, what do you think that metric would be?
I question the premise of the question because it varies per business.
Okay. That's so true. That's a really good point. Because to your point before, every podcast has a different purpose, especially if your business podcast has different goals. But I think people always look at downloads. I got to look at my downloads. Right? So maybe it's not so much just one metric. Maybe it's more, are you fulfilling the goal that you set out with the show?
I mean, I wrote a whole book about this last year, right? The different metrics you can measure for business outcomes and whatnot. And, downloads will only matter as a ratio to something else. X number of downloads is going to get me X number of new subscribers, and that's when downloads matter. But I think, for other businesses, it's I've got people who measure their success by referrals that they get from guests. I've got ones that measure like the times that they get backlinks from shows that they're a guest on, or people who cite their work, right? So I think it's so dependent on the business. But I think the most important thing is to have something. It doesn't matter what the metric is, as long as you're tracking it, because that's where a lot of people fall down. They're like, I want this and I want this and I want this and I want this. Great. Are you measuring it? No.
And what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
If you get 1,000 downloads on an episode, great for you, but what does that mean? How does that convert? What is the thing that you want them to do with that? I love that. Anna, any thoughts?
Kind of like off that, I want people to think about, because I don't think enough people think about this. So are your goals immediate, medium, or long-term impact? Because for many people, you don't see results yet because you're not supposed to see them yet. Because for some goals, it does take more time. Some goals will be immediate. Like, for instance, if you're trying to do business with someone right in front of you, like having a guest or having access to decision makers, that goal is immediate, right? It requires some follow-up after but still, right? Like you're in front of that person, you get to meet them. But for other people, let's say, if you're trying to build a body of work, if you're writing a book, for instance, and the podcast is the avenue to get you there, every single episode published will get you closer to that goal. So it's a kind of like a more like a long-term goal. So I think that really being okay with asking yourself, am I asking too much of myself by thinking that I have to hit these goals by within the first month? Because sometimes it's just longer period of waiting to get to them.
My final question for you before we wrap up today is, if we're looking ahead into the next year, what trend from this year's data do you think is going to become unavoidable next year?
Interesting, unavoidable. So like the trend that's going to become a best practice.
Yes. Yeah. Great way to reframe. Love that.
It guts me to my core to say this, but it's video.
I was thinking the same thing.
The data's in. Like that's not for every business goal, but for a heck of a lot of business goals, it makes sense to suck it up and do the video.
Yeah.
I'm going to tap on that as well, but with a little slight change. People do business with people. People do not do business with brands. And if you have not brought in more humanity because of AI, you are going to be missing out on connection. And so if there's a better reason to show up on video, is that. Get uncomfortable with messy, getting uncomfortable with like starting micro steps toward that. Being mysterious, being like, oh, I don't know what the host looks like that's out the window. People want to know. They want to know how you look. They want to see you. They want to create that connection to you. So whatever, like we talked about a few different formats to show up on video here, but do that, because it's going to be making, especially if you have a business, it's going to be making the sales process way easier, especially as many people rely on AI tools to build fake offers and all that. So video kind of puts a little bit of a damp on that. So I think that's really important to do that. So I agree with you.
I think video as well. And I'm going to take this from the perspective of, this is something that I share in different talks, that if you have an audio-based podcast and you don't want to create a video-based podcast, you don't necessarily have to. How do you take the audio-based podcast and add in a video component to meet that audience desire, if you will? You can do something as easy as take an audio snippet from your podcast episode, put it over a B-roll reel of you walking your dog, and have some sort of insightful caption on top of it. That is a way to incorporate video into your strategy. That's also something that you can do, and how you could put that on YouTube, for example. You can also, I had a client who had an audio-based show, did not want to do any video at all. And we took the audio-based podcast episodes, optimized them for YouTube, created the channel over there. The channel is monetized and it's audio-based content, right? So there's other ways to do it. You don't have to show up on video if you don't want to. It can be a huge barrier for a lot of people, but it doesn't mean that your video strategy has to be non-existent. It just looks different. That's all. And then I think one other thing that I want to add in is titles. I feel like long gone are the try a cutesy title. Like, tell me what it is. There's too much content out there. Tell me what we're getting. Tell me what we're doing. What is this podcast episode about? Put your guest names in there. I'm a fan of guest names in there because those are the things that people are searching for, especially if you're looking for someone in specific. And tell your audience what it is. Like episode 209, interview with Megan. People are like, okay, what do I get from this? What is this? Or, anyways, I digress because I'm like so passionate about that. Like, title your stuff the way it is. It doesn't need to be overly complex. So that's my
Can I leave with a last little anecdote about titles?
Yes, please.
Yes. So while we were doing the process here, we decided to dig more into titles, and you're exactly correct according to the data, include guest names and make it short. And so I thought, okay, let's look at the parts of speech at the beginnings of podcast names and how long they are. And I was starting to do this, and I was like, okay, noun, adjective, article, whatnot. And I mentioned it to my spouse, who is a linguist by education and a former copy editor by trade. And I was explaining, I'm doing this. And then they're like, you're not wrong, but your understanding is extremely shallow.
Ooh.
So they're like,
kind of like
I do that part for you. So my spouse took the list and the names and did the analysis on what the parts of speech were.
That's so good.
And so we figured out the formula for most popular podcast title, and it's article, noun or proper noun, noun. That's it.
Wow. That's a really good tip for people, because I think people can be like, oh, what am I going to title this episode? And I got to be so creative to keep it simple. Exactly. Thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. If you want to take 2 seconds, where can our audience connect with you, or where can our listener connect with you? And Megan, if you want to drop, where they can find the report, I'm going to have the link in the episode notes below, but yeah.
I'll start then with that is you can find me and my team and all the stuff that we do at onestonecreative.net. And the report, I highly encourage you to take a look. There's some fascinating data in there. Sponsored by Volt Productions. And I'd like to add,
which is true. One of. What Asha's the other one. So there's two of us. There's two of us.
Yeah, there's two of you. But since we're on your show, I'd like to mention it.
I actually forgot about that, but we didn't. This is not a sponsored episode. This is a fun episode.
But it's at onestonecreative.net/report, and you'll find links all over the homepage. So it's very easy to get.
Awesome. And for me, you can connect with me at the podcast space, THE, podcast as in like a single word, space.com. And you can find out my podcast just by adding /podcast. So, hey, it's the podcast space, same name. So that's where you can find me. And I do a lot of video and a lot of the things that we talked about. So visit me at the podcast space on Instagram. That's the place where I hang out the most.
You're so easy to find in that way. I love that. For me, you can check out one of my 700 links in the episode. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. But all the links will be in the episode notes below. Let us know if you have any questions. Reach out with your questions. Send us a DM on Instagram. Send us an email, whatever's the easiest way for you. I know we all love to chat with creators, podcasters, business owners, and so on. So I will leave it with that. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you same time, same place next week. Bye for now.